so much, Gunther. That was really good. I think I don't see any questions in the Q&A. I do want to remind you that you can add some questions to the Q&A, or any of the panelists are welcome to turn on your cameras to ask a question. But until then, I will raise a question. Gunther, you've been looking at a lot. Obviously, the talk was about the online community. Have you seen any of the rhetoric that's online being reflected in the language from political leaders, either in the US or elsewhere? Has this gained any sort of legitimacy in the mainstream on a leadership level? You've mentioned that it's gaining legitimacy across different ideological boundaries, but have you noticed?
Yeah, I mean, this is often with this question about whistleblowing words. Globalist is, for example, one of those. You can interpret this in different ways, and that's why it's very useful. So that would be one example. Also, in terms of how people speak about migrants or the borders, and but that can go in many ways. Of course, there is this. If you talk about this as an invasion, yeah, what does that mean then really? But you can also, what we've seen increasingly since the pandemic, there's a lot of Holocaust distortion going on. So depending on how you frame it, there was that's been some years, but if you say that the migrants are held in concentration camps, so that's then, what does that mean? If you downplay the Nazi concentration camps by comparing them to the imprisonment of migrants, which is bad, but it's not. I think it's very different. So yeah, you have this whistleblowing, and sometimes I think politicians do this consciously because they.
You mean dog whistling?
Yeah. Sorry. Yes. Sorry. Dog whistling. Yes. Yeah. Because it's a voter base, right? That they don't want to alienate. And what we've seen on social media, that these kind of things that get more normalized, and people get familiar with that. They see the terms, but how they interpret it then is very different, and is different also on what kind of platforms you go, what channels you are, what bubbles you're in. Yeah, but they are very useful, these whistleblowing words, absolutely. Yeah, and the one thing, of course, that the offline and online worlds, you cannot really distinguish them because there's so much, they go so much together. And if you have, so I was talking at the beginning of if you have a mindset that you want a revolution, white nationalist revolution, for example, or an anti-Semitic revolution, killing all Jews, what do you do? So you can also attack Jews and others online very effectively, even if you do it only online. So you can send massive, in an orchestrated way, messages to one person, which has a huge impact on this person. You can even, what the doxing strategies is, you can just make public where they work, where they live, the people that you're targeting, and then count on the mob that is offline and online to take more action. So that's why it's really difficult to distinguish now, increasingly difficult to distinguish between the offline and online spheres.
Thank you. Thank you. I would actually like to extend a similar question to both Andrew and Jacob, but let's pick up on this idea of dog whistling. So just to be clear to anyone who may not be familiar with it, the idea of dog whistling is a way of speaking to the far right without being overt. So sending signals to them that you're paying attention to them. But so they're getting messages, but the general public won't notice the nature of the message. And I'm particularly, both Well, Jacob talked about threats to Republicans or threats to people in the same party. And then Andy talked about the way that Christian nationalists will form allegiances with different lawmakers in terms of lobbying. Is there any sort of signaling that you all see or have observed in your research that has that kind of messaging? Either of you can go first.
Andrew, any thoughts?
Sure, I'll pop in. I think a lot of it, at least in terms of, dog whistling related to different rhetoric is, the most important part of a good dog whistle, if you're an actor who is employing it, is making sure that it can mean whatever it needs to mean to whoever you need it to mean it to. And I would refer to it sort of in the realm of religious language as Christianese sometimes. It's not as intense or like a call to violence in that realm, but it is something that sort of signals the in-group relationship in a certain way. I will say that I've worked with homiletics, which is sort of how people present sermons, and worked with people on those. And one of the things I noticed is a lot of folks, when they're being trained in this, will use phrases like the culture, the culture, the culture, the culture. And they'll say the culture over and over and over again. And I one time had to sit them down and be like, okay, so let's replace the word the culture with them and see how weird and gross that feels. And then when they did it, they were like, oh, that's not great. So, it's one of those things where like it can be picked up, and that's why the frequency of the whistle is so important. But that's the only thing that I have related to that. It's sometimes it just shows like a wink and a nod that we both understand what's happening here.
I think that's a really interesting point, and I would just use it to I would extend it to something that happened just the other day, not necessarily related to the topic of my talk today, but just earlier this week, President Trump used a word in a speech that got a lot of play in the media. He said the word bloodbath. And I think he basically said, he was talking about markets, and then halfway through this talk, he goes, oh, well, if we lose the election, it'll be a bloodbath. I was just writing down a couple of other examples of this, right? So stand back and stand by to the Proud Boys. There were very fine people on both sides at Charlottesville. Death wish about McConnell. When they said there'll be bedlam in the country after, I think that was right after the Mar-a-Lago raid, or shortly thereafter. Is quite clever in a way in terms of the signaling, because on the one hand, you can easily hide and say something like, oh, we were talking about a bloodbath in the markets. But to Andrew's point, the individuals in the movement, listen, whether it's deliberate or not, whether it's purposeful or not, that rhetoric, whether it's trying to speak to people or not, the people we worry about, like who we're talking about as conducting acts of violence, they are interpreting it in a certain way. They are taking it in a certain way. And they actually enjoy the back and forth in the media, because they know that it just reinforces for them that they're getting the right message, the message that they want to pull. So I just think there's a broader, whether or not the signaling is purposeful or not, there's just a broader normalization of violence. And there's a broader normalization of the fact that if you disagree on policy, like violence, assassination is a legitimate exercise of your grievance. Some of the things that people get assassination threats for these days is crazy, like voting for a continuing resolution to keep the government open. Well, you're a traitor. You went against the movement. You went against the orthodoxy. Now you can be assassinated. I think that comes from this broader normalization of violent rhetoric and then violent action, whether it's a purposeful signal or not.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad that we spent some time emphasizing this idea so that all of us and the attendees could be aware and recognize it when we see it. At this point, it's time to bring our respondents in. So I invite the respondents to turn on your cameras, and the presenters can turn off their cameras unless they're asked a question, and then I'd ask you to turn your cameras back on. Thanks. Why don't I throw it all out and ask Brad to go first?
Okay. I'd like to thank each of the speakers for their thought-provoking presentations. And I have a question for each speaker. First, for Andrew, what can we do to encourage the separation of church and state in a country where they're supposed to be separated?
Yeah, this is a softball to open up with. You know, I would say that I think part of it is, to use a term, it's just like having grace for other people in that sense. And I think it's hard because, to go to what we were just having a discussion about with language and othering and terms, when you're being told that you're being attacked and you're being persecuted, you act out of fear. And you act out of survival instincts, you know, and the country is becoming, you know, in having worked in the church, you know, the country is becoming less religious. And so people see that as a rebuke. They see that as, you know, and it's not necessarily like religious, it's more of affiliations with certain churches. And so I would say grace is important. So like I understand and empathize with why people are acting the way they do. I don't agree with it. You know, I know that a lot of people that are my friends don't share the same views as me, but I think part of that is just dialogue. The separation of church and state, I think it's easy when you have political actors trying to speak in religious language who are not necessarily familiar with it. And they may not know what it means, you know, and they may pull quotes and they may reference scripture, but they don't know what that means, you know, and you have people who spend years studying this stuff. And they'll write, you know, a whole thing about Paul's letters. And, you know, you may get somebody who is a messaging person for a political campaign who's like, I need to speak to voters to amplify them, and I'm going to reference this. So I think it's just understanding that, you know, people have sincere worldviews, they have sincere beliefs, but we all share this space together. We had chosen this experiment. We had chosen these values of pluralism and democracy. And so like, it's not your religion, it's not your fear. Like no one's going to say you can't believe these things. And I 100% stand by that. Like that is not our place to legislate belief, but it is when you start infringing that upon people who may not, you know, like Jews and Buddhists and Muslims, you know, and you think about 9/11, like post that period and the rhetoric used in that community towards that community. And so it's just having a little bit of grace with each other and making sure that we understand that we share this space. This is a common living space. It's the public square. And so we should be on our best behavior.
Thanks. Yeah, religious freedom is not the freedom to impose religious beliefs on others. Yeah, for Jacob, the U.S. extremist database indicates that about 3/4 of terrorist acts in the U.S. are committed by right-wing extremists. What can be done to hold them accountable for their violent threats and actions? For example, what can be done to convince, you talked about they may be a threat to the Republican Party itself. Do you have any ideas about what can be done to hold them accountable?
Yeah, let me give you a brief kind of rundown on the things that we talk about in our book, but that I've spoken about and advocate for elsewhere. We need to do more for pushing back on social media. I mean, I'd be interested for Gunther's thoughts here, but I have called in my writings for the basically we need content moderation and we need algorithm reform to try to push back against the free reign of harmful content on social media, and we're not getting that. So we need to think about how to remove some of the protections that social media companies have, right? Section 230 reform being one. We don't have a domestic terrorism law in the United States, so none of the individuals who have been mentioned in any of this seminar as committing acts of violence domestically have domestic terrorism statutes. Not a single one of them, except people at the state level, perhaps. So we need to close that. But I think also, almost building off Andrew's point, is one of the things that I have found in my studies to be very upsetting and really difficult to approach is the rising level of what you might call personal vulnerabilities or personal factors in cases of extremism, to include things like youth, mental health issues, histories of isolation and loneliness and bullying, histories of violence in the home, histories of parental or partner suicide, substance abuse, like real vulnerabilities, real issues that people have. I can't remember if it was in this, it was in the previous session this morning. I think it was Reverend Meyer spoke about wanting to talk about suicides among veterans as being, related to the extremism issue. I totally agree. I think there are really strong vulnerabilities in that community, because we see high levels of combat veterans, especially in the veteran extremism space. So we need to think about what it looks like to institute like public health measures of counterterrorism to try and push back, right? People in my field call that countering violent extremism. It's really hard to do because the scale is enormous, and it's really hard to get metrics on that kind of information. Like, it's hard to prove how many people you stopped from radicalizing. But I think there's a lot of work to be done in that space. Now, the good news is the Department of Homeland Security, which runs what's called CP3, Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships, have really upped their grant making for public health organizations working in this space. But as I said, the scale is enormous. I really think if I may, I think that's the biggest and most frightening conclusion from this kind of seminar, is the scale of extremism, the scale of the mainstreaming is enormous. And so pushing back on that is also an enormous challenge.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, Gunther, thank you for your presentation. You talked about how extremist groups use social media to further their causes. And one of the most robust findings in psychology is that bad is stronger than good. So, for example, if you eat a food that makes you sick, you won't touch that food ever again, right? I mean, you avoid it at all costs. Whereas if you eat a food that you really love, it doesn't have the same impact. And I'm wondering how, it seems like the social media can be used for bad. And I understand that bad is stronger than good, but it seems like there's a challenge to how can social media be used to reduce white supremacy, to reduce anti-Semitism? Do you have any ideas about that in 3 minutes?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for this. This is a really good question. And I want to stress what Jacob just said. We need to also think about, before we think about, okay, how do we use it in a very productive way, to say, well, there need to be some moderation and also transparency and some thinking about how we want to have these spaces operate. The social media is really becoming, as I said, part of our daily lives of most people. And it is very much the framework is determined by private companies. And that's the setting. And private companies that are mostly hosted in the United States, but not all of them. And then you have, like, the private companies, they can do more or less whatever they want on these platforms. That's the legal status now. Yeah. So they can promote the things that they want. They can take off the people that they want, or the users. And so far, the companies that we have seen, most of them, but not all of them, the smaller ones have most of them have an economic interest. They want to make money. And in the economic interest, it's not to have too many of these fringe groups there, because then people will say, oh, I don't want to advertise there. So that's in the economic interest, most of them. But that also means, well, they want to keep these, whatever fringe groups are, also engaged, but not much interaction with the others. Or not so obvious, maybe. So they just want to avoid these kind of clashes then that they might have. What we've seen really only since 2017, when in Charlottesville, there were these images and there was an awareness. Okay, now the mobilization that was online can have an impact offline, and people go marching, and these are not nice images. And sponsors, like people who invest in advertisement, that they don't want to support this necessarily because it's bad for their image.
Yeah.
Right, but I mean, this is, and then on top of that, so there is a kind of, it's not very strong incitement for the companies themselves to reduce that a little bit, but not very strong.
Thank you.
And then you have, also companies that, private companies that are still in the United States, like Gap, they have an ideological aim. So one of my students he is here also. He does a fascinating work on the person who started Gap, who owns Gap. He has a mission, right, that goes beyond making money. And then you have companies that are outside the United States, and then you can have maybe even like political ambitions in many ways from control. I mean, TikTok, that's why part of the discussions are, what do we do with TikTok? Okay, so that's the setting. So I think there needs to be a conversation that in the societies we need to have, okay, what kind of communication do we want to have? And also the developments are very fast in these on these platforms. Do we want to have a say as a society in that? Right, and this is a discussion that has started only a few years ago, and there is also not enough people who use social media that don't know enough about how that works, and we've seen that. So there must be more awareness of that. That's, I think, one thing. And then of course you can, I mean, this is a tool that you can use for all kinds of propaganda, but I'm not sure if counter propaganda would be the right thing to do, but of course more like awareness. And this is, I think, we need to go back also to what we do in education and messaging and being aware of what, and that's why I think we have to have a conversation in society. How do we want to have communication, not only offline but also online? What's the frame that we're gonna agree on?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gunther. Reverend Dr. Meyer?
Well, I took a lot of notes from each one of you, Andrew and Jacob and Gunther. And I know our time is growing short here. But I want to begin with saying this, that the collective disparagement of any group is morally unacceptable. I want to just be very clear about that, especially after listening to Gunther's presentation on anti-Semitism. But the concern applies across the board. The collective disparagement of any group is morally unacceptable. And to that point, I think that what we see as one of the primary MOs of extremism is collective disparagement of some group, creating the outcast, creating the problem that we provide the solution for by getting rid of that problem. And this has really been driven high. And we had this conversation about dog whistles. So I'm not going to name the Archbishop, but at a very big public event, overwhelming, he began his sermon saying, "We don't even know what a woman is today." So we know what that dog whistle was about. And if you don't, text me. I'll be glad to help you with it. But then went on to say in his sermon that if society doesn't legislate church values, it's attacking the church. I want you to just think about that for a moment. If society doesn't legislate church values, it's attacking the church. And what we have seen then in Florida is a tremendous, terrifying campaign against trans and queer people. So the conversation earlier about separation of church and state has to be at a much more profound level because the church is not a monolith in any kind of way. It exists in all kinds of different things. I would, in fact, make the argument we're becoming a more religious society, not a less religious society, but religion is being defined individualistically as what is binding me to the rest of the world. I'm not being forced to accept somebody else's definition of what binds me to the rest of the world, which is what the root meaning of the word religion is. So as I look at these very profound concerns, what I see whether Breitbart openly adopting Leninism as the methodology to set up an autocracy, not trying to go to communism, trying to set up autocracy, but Lenin is the way. Or you have the organization in DC that runs the National Prayer Breakfast, the family, their leader openly said we need to organize the way Hitler organized his inner circle. And we should all be, I mean, all of these are based upon the collective disparagement of other people. As I listened to what Jacob was talking about the internal violence within the mission, I mean, they will disparage their own kind. So along with this disparagement is a commitment to using violence, at least psychologically, if not physically, in some kind, way, or shape. And so as I look at all this, it really seems to me that that the necessity of violence for social ordering applies across the field. And that we are not calling that out, that there should be no necessity for violence, period. And that's completely nonpartisan. And that it applies in the church as well as in the state and everywhere else. And I'm just wondering how each of you understand the moral necessity for clarity of a voice about nonviolence in society moving forward.
Thank you. We have just a little bit more than 10 minutes left. So if people want to give them like a minute to this before we let Felicia speak, go ahead.
Andrew,
Gunther,
you
have your mic off, so go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely, it's necessary. One of the achievements in democracy is that we say violence is to the state, and we discuss our differences and try to work them out in discussions, and that we accept disagreement, and that we don't attack the person but the position. And this has been lost in many spaces, offline and online. So we need to strengthen that again.
I would say really quick, it's just speaking truth to our friends as well as our enemies in reference to their behavior if they promote violent acts. And we have to be as full-throated in both directions.
Just a quick thought. I've been doing some work at my workplace, the council, on election violence in 2024 and how you try and get ahead of it. And one of the really frightening conclusions I came to was like, basically, there's nothing government can do because government is no longer a trusted actor. So any step the government takes, we're almost in a security dilemma. Any step the government takes will be seen as a escalation. And so I've been spending a lot of time trying to think about who are the trusted institutions that can advance the kind of message you're sending, right? Not a message of ideology or politics, but a message of pure nonviolence and trust and faith. Government's out of the picture, right? Universities and schools are out of the picture because they're not trusted. The media is not trusted. The institutions I came down to were like the church, although maybe Andrew, based on your presentation, maybe that's not as straightforward, but the church, like labor unions, professional sports teams, Hollywood. I think it's time to try to mobilize some of those civil society actors that still have trust to advance non-violence measures that are not based on ideology, right? We're not going to agree on abortion, for example, but can we agree on not being violent on behalf of our views on abortion? I think that, but that's very, very challenging.
Thank you. Wow, that was great. Felicia, your turn.
Okay, I'll be very fast. Let me pull up my notes here. I had 2 questions, 1 comment. Gunther, when you were talking, one of the things about the dog whistling, one of the things that I was thinking about was the notion that it is very powerful in that because of its broad appeal, or you can interpret the message any way that you want, that people are going to like that because it makes them feel special. Oh, I got the message. This message was for me. I can decipher the message, right? And it just serves to kind of entrench folks in that because of that interpretation, that unique interpretation. And I just psychologically, I think that's just a very powerful tool. So thank you. That was fascinating to just talk about. So I'm grateful for you bringing that up. Thank you. Andrew, my question for you was, Laura, I can't remember when we got to do this before. A couple years ago now?
October 22.
Thank you. So when we did this last year, there was a presentation about the combination and use of social media, like podcasts, whatever, with product placement. And so I was thinking about when you were, and it was a fascinating talk. Obviously, I am still remember it today. And when you were talking, and I was looking at the pictures that you had of the pastor and all, I remember that podcast, and I was like, I wonder if there's also product placement for some of his products along with these podcasts that are then being, and just how powerful that combination can be for folks. And so I would love to know that.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of this is, these people have their own sort of businesses, consulting firms, podcasts. You also see, and I'll kind of stretch it a little bit more too. So you're starting to see as well with like business organizations that are being founded specifically around like a specific worldview, like religious worldview that is restricted.
Oh, interesting.
So like, for example, in the Catholic Church, we have the Napa Institute, which is like a very large sort of socially conservative think tank that you have to have like a certain kind of gravitas to be able to enter. And then you also have groups at local levels like Legatus, which is like sort of you have to either have so much money as a business or have so many people. And then they kind of give out these sort of worldview things of like how to run like a Christian business in that sense.
Oh, interesting.
Pushback thing. So it's all kind of like when I worked for the church, one of my favorite lines was the most dangerous words at the parish is "I know a guy." And that's because, you can either get like a really good product or you could get something that's like, I know a guy and he can do this for us.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, everybody's got something they need to sort of sell, promote. There's tours where people go around and talk about like an American Christianity, the foundation, this sort of alternative history of the founding, and they'll sell books, and some of it's based in Revelations and some of it's based in, they all have products. Everybody has, having worked in marketing and comms, it's always a brand. It's always a brand. It's always something.
Right. Well, I mean, so I think it speaks to just the use of religion, or in some cases that I feel like I've seen, like the use of religion as a front for the business, right? And the business is that's primary, but religion is used as a shield. So it was fascinating. Thank you so much. And then my last comment, Jacob, was thinking about your comment about the about danger, particularly for folks even on the right. And here's what I was thinking about with that was, kind of will there be pushback, right, from folks on the right to kind of call out what's happening? And what I started thinking about was, well, I don't know, because ego is involved, right? Ego to get reelected, ego to curry favor with whomever you need to curry favor. And so until it outweighs its usefulness, there has to be the danger is not enough, right? It just doesn't do enough to stop or to compel people to say enough is enough. And so I would love to hear your thoughts. Am I way off base? I just love to hear what you think.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I agree with you. It's I sometimes reflect. I mean, you can play a counterfactual game and say things like, let's say Mike Pence is assassinated on January 6th.
Yeah.
Does that change things because
Yeah.
the violence isn't abstract anymore?
Right. That's right. Yeah. Yep.
My co-author who's studied terrorism for 50 years. He gets asked this question when we go out on our book tour, and basically says, this is going to be a very depressing ending to this seminar. I'm so sorry, but people ask him, so having studied terrorism for 50 years, how does this end? And he says, it will get better, but it'll take a tragedy to get there.
Yep.
And so January 6th, the subtext there is January 6th was not enough of a tragedy.
Yeah, that's right.
The white supremacists like seen in all these places have not been enough of a tragedy.
That's right.
So what is the tragedy?
Yep. Yeah. Had someone ask me in the gun violence prevention work that I get to do in Michigan, asked me, to try and answer why some of my colleagues were not voting for these measures. Are super common sense. Like, we had all sorts of folks who were gun owners in support of them. And I said, I feel like it's going to take a personal tragedy, one of their family members. And it's terrible to say something so awful. But I think it also speaks to something that I struggle with and I'm really saddened by, that just in general in our world. And I think it's that collectively we are living in a time where the lack of empathy is so great. And that lack of empathy is just permeating so many aspects of our life. And we're seeing the ugliness as a result of that.
Yeah, I agree.
So thank you all. I want to just throw something out there. I'm sure that people have seen the Q&A. There was a question from an anonymous attendee. Could an argument be made that radicalization is systemic, and in order to combat it, systemic action should be taken? It's a big question. And I see that nobody has tried to answer it offline. But I think it's worth pondering. Dr. Meyer, I see you turned off your mic.
Yeah, I saw that too. It's unorganized, if you will. And so I think that's part of the difficulty with giving a brief answer. If you're out at sea and it's a cloudy day, the sea looks a different color than if it's a bright day. And so what I want to say is the radicalization, to me, is a reflection of what I talked about earlier, the fragilization of the meta-narrative that gives us meaning to all things. And so that fragilization does happen systemically, but the response to it is building a healthy and ordered society in which more and more people find their place of belonging. And that takes a desire for the common will, and to be able to say, oh, well, I don't quite see it that way, but we can work together anyway. And we just don't have enough of that right now, because That spirit doesn't raise money in the political sphere. And you can't be in the political sphere without money. So that's one of the reasons why I asked about changing the fair and balanced rule. We need to create conversation across the aisle, not within the aisle. And we don't have any mechanisms that's really saying, sit down together. Like I say to my grandchildren, you two sit together and work it out, right? We don't have any mechanism doing that for us in society today.
Thank you, Andrew.
That was a great kind of thing to kind of prompt something for me. I was thinking a lot about last year, Dr. Dugan and I did some work with the Divided Community Project. And one of the things that they were talking about in divided communities at the Moritz College of Law at Ohio State, one of the things they talked about is the idea of like, who are the arbiters? You know, who are the moderators? Who are the people who bring people together? And we can't agree on that. You know, and so the idea is that that's why, to go to the comments about institutions being under attack, you know, everything's under attack. If there's any lever of power, somebody has to stand against it, it feels like. And so we cannot agree, you know, and one of the things I used to always think about is we've kind of moved, and we've kind of moved to a point where instead of agreeing to just go out to dinner as a group, somebody has a strong opinion that we're going to go have pineapple pizza tonight. And I love pineapple pizza, but I know not everybody does. And if I'm insistent upon this, you may not even agree to come to dinner with me, even though you like my company. And so we get to the point where in society, we are so strongly telling folks what they need and how to solve things and not seeing the empathy and not seeing those kinds of discussions that we can't even agree that we want to sit down at dinner together, let alone to eat dinner, let alone that we even agree that dinner is a thing that we eat. So that would just kind of be my sense, but divided communities work in related to, you know, us attacking people under, you know, going after anything that serves as a mediator or you know, we're always working the refs, it feels like, in democracy right now.
Awesome. Well, I think this is a great way to end. I'd like all of the panelists to turn on your cameras, please, so that we can say goodbye. And I also want to put a plug out. We will be sending a follow-up email to everyone who registered for the symposium, as well as to all of the presenters, to see if you're interested in keeping in touch, because of the magnitude of this issue that has been repeated over and over again, and the unwieldiness of it. That perhaps that we can form ongoing relationships and collaborations going forward. And of course, this is very important, not just in academic circles, but in practitioner circles and in public circles, to sort of stay within each other's orbit. So we'll be asking to see if you're interested in that. I don't know what form it'll take, but certainly we can share information with you all. So thank you all for coming. This has been really fantastic. I'm really pleased with how all of you turned up. I just pulled it together and you all made it great. So thank you.